Hello? All right, I think it is time to start this afternoon session. Hope you had a good lunch, and I hope you're awake. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vito De Lucia, and I am one of the co-conveners of this session, and I will be moderating today's session. And there will be, this is the first of two sessions of this science program. The second one will take place right after. This session is called Governance and Policy for Sustainable Space Activities, and it takes this like broad topic or a point of departure, the fact that the space sector is expanded across a whole range of Arctic relevant activities, domains, in terms of monitoring, Earth observation, security-related aspects, cross-domain governance, industrial development and activities, resources mapping, and there is an increasing need for exploring space-related issues with regards to governance, with regards to industrial development. There's domain-specific problems that need to be addressed, but also cross-domain relationships that need to be mapped and explored in between, for example, the low the sea and the outer space domain. And this is all made more complicated by the deteriorating geopolitical context within which all these activities take place, and they're increasingly securitized. And so we'll explore some of these issues through our presenters, and today we will focus on, or this session we will focus on legal and governance aspects, whereas in the next session we'll focus more on issues related to space development and affairs and technologies. So I will just now introduce the first speaker. The session is organized in such a way that we will have 3 presentations at first, and then we'll have a panel discussion. We were scheduled to have 4 speakers. One unfortunately had to cancel, but that means that we'll have quite a bit more time for panel and questions at the end. So the first speaker is Fiammetta Borgia, who is a professor of international law at the University of Rome Tor Vergata, also is the director of the Italian Center for the Law of the Sea, and is one leading expert on Arctic-related issues. And she will present a talk. She will be our keynote, and her talk is titled Arctic-Based Space Operations, Legal Gaps in Dual-Use Governance. Fiammetta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vito. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It is my second time here in Arctic Frontiers. The first time was in 2011. It was a smaller conference, but it was interesting as today. So today I will speak about Arctic-based space operation, and my remarks today will focus on Arctic-based space operation, and my perspective will be an international law perspective. My assumption is that the Arctic should not be treated as a legally exceptional space requiring ad hoc solution, but it should be understood as stress test that exposes structural limits in the way international law governs technologically integrated activities. Space infrastructure located in Arctic, ground station, tracking facilities, data relay hubs are not legal problematic because they are new, but they are problematic because they sit at the intersection of multiple legal regimes that were designed to operate separately. The Arctic simply makes this tension visible earlier and more clearly than the other region. The legal debate surrounding Arctic space infrastructure is often framed in terms of regulatory gaps. I would suggest today reframing this question. The issue is not whether international law applies, it clearly does. The issue is how different bodies of international law interact, or more precisely, how they fail to interact when regulating the same activity. This creates legal uncertainty not because rules are missing, but because multiple regimes apply at the same time without coordination. In other words, this is not a problem of norm production, but a problem of legal framework. If we look closely, Arctic-based space infrastructure is regulated everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and every relevant legal regime applies partially, yet none provides a comprehensive normative framework. This produces uncertainty, not only for states, but also for operators, local communities, and international cooperation mechanisms. So the legal question today is not which law applies, but rather how these laws interact and what happens when they do not. To understand this point of view, we must clarify the legal object. Arctic-based space infrastructure are neither purely terrestrial installation, nor space activity in the strict sense, nor maritime infrastructure as traditionally understood. They have three characteristics. First, they are territorial located. This is immediately triggers state jurisdiction. Second, they are functional transboundary. Data and services produced there circulate globally and support activity far beyond the Arctic. Third, they are structurally dual use, meaning that civilian, commercial, and security-related functions are technologically intertwined. However, international law regulates such infrastructure as if this dimension could be neatly separated. This assumption no longer works. This creates a mismatch between legal categories and technological reality. In this sense, Arctic space infrastructure is not problematic because it's hybrid, but because the law has no clear way of dealing with hybridity. The three legal regimes are relevant at the same time. International space law that regulates the use of outer space, the law of the sea that governs maritime zone and activity in the sea, Arctic governance framework address cooperation, environmental protection, and regional stability. None of these regimes has priority over the others, yet none of them provides rules of how they should interact. As a result, each regime addresses part of the problem, but no regime governs the activity as a whole. What matters, therefore, is not the existence of multiple regimes, but the absence of legal tools that govern their interaction. Let's see how. So, international space law, particularly the Outer Space Treaty, is conceptually orbit-oriented. Its core principles were developed to regulate activities conducted in outer space, such as satellite operation and exploration. Ground-based infrastructure that merely enables space activity was not at the center, at the core of the legal vision. This explains why space law remained largely silent on the issues such as the environmental impact of ground station, for example, data governance, and indirect military use. In the Arctic context, this silence becomes problematic because ground infrastructure is very relevant for polar satellite system. As a result, Arctic ground stations are functionally essential to space activities, but from the point of view of law, peripheral in space law. This is not a gap of the Outer Space Treaty. It's the result of legal regime developed in a very different technological context. However, when ground-based infrastructure become the backbone of space operation, the structural silence turns into a regulatory weakness. The same structural logic can be observed in the law of the sea. Let's see. So the law of the sea presents a different but equally significant limitation. UNCLOS is built on a horizontal and zonal conception of maritime space. Generally, it regulates activities across maritime zone from internal waters to the high sea. It governs what happens across maritime space, not vertically, not above the sea. It offers no framework for infrastructure whose operational chain connects. So, in this case, for space infrastructure, seabed, the sea surface, the atmosphere, and the orbital space. However, modern maritime governance increasingly depends on satellite-enabled function that operates vertically. So these vertical connectivity fall outside the traditional logic of the convention, the UNCLOS. UNCLOS govern maritime space, but not the technological infrastructure that make contemporary maritime governance possible. Satellite-enabled surveillance is now essential for the exercise of coastal states' rights under UNCLOS, for example, yet the infrastructure that make such surveillance possible remain largely outside the convention normative framework. This creates a paradox. UNCLOS increasingly depends on technology, but it does not regulate it. On the third side, Arctic governance. Arctic governance framework have been successful in promoting cooperation and environmental protection. In this kind of cooperation, the security issues were avoided in order to maintain political stability before. Dual space infrastructure, despite their relevance for environmental monitoring in local communities, fall outside the scope of Arctic governance mechanism because of their security dimension. This creates a paradox again. Because infrastructure are central for strategic awareness and maritime security operates within governance framework that were never designed to address security concern, a gap between governance objective and operational realities. In these three frameworks, we have to insert dual-use technologies. So dual-use technology today is not an exception, is a structural condition of the contemporary space infrastructure. The same Arctic space infrastructure may enable climate research, support commercial navigation, provide data usable for defense and intelligence purposes. Therefore, the traditional civilian-military dichotomy becomes inadequate today. Civilian, commercial, and security-related functions are no longer separable in technical terms. International law, however, still relies on a civilian-military dichotomy that presupposes such separability. This generates a systemic tension between transparency obligation, national security, accountability mechanism. This tension related dual-use technologies challenges international law by forcing legal regime to confront function rather than labels. The legal problem here is not whether an infrastructure is civilian or military. but how its multiple functions are governed at the same time. International law still lack tools to address this functional overlap without resorting to rigid categorical distinction. This reflection that is about the status quo brings us to a broader theoretical implication for Arctic. Traditionally, the debate on fragmentation in international law has focused on horizontal overlap between specialized legal regimes. What the Arctic reveals today is a different configuration. In this case, fragmentation is no longer horizontal between regimes competing over the same object. Here, regimes coexist and function properly within their respective domains. The difficulties arise precisely when activities cut across their boundaries. Each regime applies partially, but none governs the activity as a whole. Fragmentation, therefore, becomes functional. It does not stem from conflict between norms, but from the fact that law consistently stops short of the points where functions are integrated. This can be described, or I describe, as a form of regime interaction by omission, not because regimes should coordinate but fail to do so, but because there is no shared regulatory space in which coordination could meaningfully occur. Fragmentation becomes problematic not when rules contradict each other, like is usually, but when critical function interface remain legally unaddressed. The Arctic makes this particularly visible because technological integration is especially intense, while legal governance remain strongly sector-based. At this point, it should be clear that the regulatory difficulty I'm describing is not one about the overlapping or conflicting legal regime. Each regime does what it is supposed to do. The problem is that they all stop before the point where the activity becomes integrated. Fragmentation, therefore, does not arise between norms, but between integrated activities and sector-based regulation, such as dual-use infrastructure for ocean observation. Dual use, thus, is not where the solution lies, but where the problem becomes visible. It is not a sector, and it does not require a new regime. Rather, dual use is the point at which otherwise separate legal regimes becomes at the same time relevant without actually overlapping. They do not coordinate, and they do not conflict. They simply touch along the dual-use dimension, and this is where the functional gap emerges. This is what dual-use appears as a locus of regime interaction in practice. So consider satellite-based maritime surveillance in the Arctic. Polar orbit observation satellites generate high-resolution data supporting civilian functions such as navigational safety, ice monitoring, and environmental protection. At the same time, the very same data are functionally relevant for maritime surveillance and situational awareness. It is this functional continuity across civilian and security-relevant uses that activities the dual-use codification. To dual use, otherwise separate legal regime, become at the same time relevant to the same infrastructure, even though they do not regulate the same activity as such. What interact here are not the regimes as current walls, but specific legal categories within them. From international space law, this brings into play categories such as state responsibility and Euroguard. From law of the sea, for example, the reliance on satellite data indirectly activates obligations related to maritime safety, environmental protection, and cooperation. Arctic governance framework contributed procedural expectation linked to the scientific cooperation and environmental monitoring while remaining formally detached from the security regulation. These categories do not overlap and they do not conflict. They are brought into functional proximity by the dual-use character of the activity and become at the same time relevant to its integrate effect. So dual use operates as a point of illegal interaction between regime, not by integrating them, but by aligning their internal legal categories around the same infrastructure. The gap remains, but is no longer diffuse or accidental. It becomes clear, understandable, and legally located at the interface created by integrated dual-use activities. So let me conclude with a few words. The challenge, therefore, even in space activity in Arctic, is not to design a new legal framework for the Arctic. Arctic-based space operations do not call for an exceptional legal regime. They call for reconsidering how international law addresses the interaction of existing regimes when they become at the same time relevant to the same infrastructure without overlapping. In this sense, the Arctic matters not because it's legally unique, but because it reveals earlier and more sharply the structural limit of sector-based regulation in an era of functional convergence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiammetta, for a very exciting presentation and a new way to look at the traditional problem of the fragmentation of international law. So I look forward to the Q&A to discuss further this perspective. Perfectly on time. So now we turn on to our second presenter, who should join us online. His name is Leonardo Cerisano, and he's an associate at the Italian law firm Satta Romano and Associati. Leonardo, you there? The title of the presentation is The Arctic and Outer Space as Global Commons Towards a Hybrid Governance Architecture. Is he on?
Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm just having some issues with my presentation. Okay. Okay, perfect. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Did you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Leonardo Cerisano, and I'm a trainee lawyer at Italian boutique law firm Satta Romano and Associati. And it is a pleasure for me to be here. I would like to start my presentation with a brief introduction. Nowadays, despite their differences in their legal regimes, Arctic and outer space are inextricably linked by their fundamental character for the progress and the very survival of human race. And it is by this point of view that in my presentation, I define Arctic and outer space as global commons by a functional point of view. And the aim of this research, of this presentation, is to try to draw a particularly regulatory framework for Arctic space operations based on some pillars, on some provisions of the BBNG Treaty, also known as High Seas Treaty. Let's start with some definitions. Global commons have traditionally been linked to the concept of common heritage of humankind. And by their very definition, common goods are detached from any territorial sovereignty by any territorial jurisdiction. And this is reflected on the legal instruments used in international law to protect those type of goods. First of all, the erga omnes obligations. This type of obligations is fundamental to protect values and goods which are which represents an interest of humanity as a whole, of the international community as a whole. And this type of obligation is fundamental, yes, to protect those goods. And from an international responsibility perspective, we need to mention the Article 48 of Hartzival, which allows any state to react in the face of the breach of an obligation owed to the international community as a whole, namely an erga omnes obligation. So how can we try to define outer space and Arctic as global commons? As for the outer space, we can find some legal basis for this definition, namely Article 1, 2, 3, and 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. But we can also try to define outer space as a global common from a functional perspective. As recognized by the United Nations General Assembly in the 4165 resolution, nowadays outer space activities are fundamental for the protection, for the safeguard of some fundamental human rights. So we can also try to define outer space as a global common from this point of view. As for the Arctic, I'm well aware of the controversies which exist on the possible definition of the Arctic as a global common. But as I told in my introduction, nowadays Arctic shared some functional features with goods that are common, which are clearly identified common goods. For example, environmental vulnerability, transboundary externalities, strategic relevance, and growing economic interests. So, of this presentation is to draw a particularly regulatory framework for Arctic space operation, or to try to draw a regulatory laboratory for for Arctic-centered space operation, with the more general aim to stimulate an evolution in an environmental sense of the general international space law. And I chose some provisions from the BBNG Treaty, and I tried to imagine their implementation in the governance of outer space activities and Arctic space activities. Let's start with the preamble. Recognizing the importance of contributing to the realization of a just and equitable international economic order, which takes into account the interests and needs of humankind as a whole, and in particular, the special interests and needs of developing states, whether coastal or landlocked. In my opinion, the implementation of such a provision in the outer space regulatory framework would function as a substantive filter to prioritize genuinely beneficial space activities and to discourage opportunistic uses that deepen exclusion and undermine the long-term sustainability of both outer space and Arctic region. Okay. Then Article 1 of the High Seas Treaty. Article 1, para 7 and 13. Namely, the definition of environmental impact assessment and sustainable use. As for the environmental impact assessment, I think that it would be fundamental to implement this duty in the regulatory framework for outer space activities, to implement the provision of the Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, to implement the principle of due regard, which is provided for in Article 9 of Outer Space Treaty, and to try to draw an environmental protection of outer space. As for this definition of sustainable use, I think that it would be fundamental to implement it in the regulatory framework for outer space to introduce a normative orientation toward intergenerational stewardship, ensuring that Arctic space activities remain compatible with continued availability and functionality of these interconnected environments. Then Article 2. The objective of this agreement is to ensure that the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction for the present and in the long term, through effective implementation of the relevant provision of the Convention and further international cooperation and coordination. Such an objective, in my opinion, will frame economic utilization with a logic of stewardship, encouraging coordinated actions among states and private operators, enabling a more coherent response to cumulative pressures affecting both the orbital domain and the Arctic environment. Then Article 7, with the principle of equity and equitable share of benefits and the principle of precautionary approach. I think that also the implementation of these two principles will be fundamental to protect outer space and Arctic and to as global commons. And that's all. Thank you for your kind attention.
All right, thank you, Leonardo, for a very interesting presentation on drawing from the BBNG Treaty, which is really close to my heart, to imagine a governance architecture for an integrated management of space activities related to the Arctic. Now we are on to our third presenter, who is Giacomo Bruni from the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, Norway. Giacomo is a doctoral researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO, better known as PRIO, where he studied geopolitics at the intersection of technology and security. He leads a project funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Defense on space geopolitics and its security implication for Norway. And the title of his talk is Steering Arctic Space Policy, Norway's Role in Geopolitics, Governance, and Sustainability. The floor is yours, Giacomo. 10 minutes. And
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be in Tromsø. Never in my life I could have imagined that I would be in a panel with not one, not two, but three other Italians in Tromsø talking about Arctic space governance. That is a first for sure. Thanks, Vito, for the nice introduction, and thanks, Fiammetta and Leonardo, for nice presentations. I've seen many points of convergence, so I'm sure we will have a great panel discussion afterwards. I'll just say a few more words about myself. How do I switch this? Is it? Yeah, okay. A few more words about myself and the research project, just so that you know what you can expect and what you cannot expect from me. I'm a last year doctoral researcher in political science at the University of Oslo, and I work at PRIO as a doctoral researcher. By the way, at PRIO there is a lot of good research going on, so please go on the website, look at what we do. There's a lot of good research going on there. And I also at PRIO co-lead the Security and Technology Research Group. I'm saying this, and this is of relevance because most of what I do really is at the intersection between security and technology. If I was to simplify what my research agenda is, I adopt an international relations perspective, which is very much informed by critical security studies and science and technology studies. And I mainly look at two set of questions. The first one relates to technologies, and how do technologies change international security and global affairs, or affect international security and global affairs? And the second one is, how do small and medium powers, what can small and medium powers do to navigate what we see as an increasingly great power, rivalry dominated domain? And then, as Vito mentioned, I am leading a project that was given funding from the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. You see at the bottom right of the slide the title, and I can talk more about what the project is about if you ask me a question afterwards. I'm very happy to do that. Part of what we do, I'll just mention this, is that we have been collecting and comparing sources from many, many different countries. But we have also been engaging in a lot of talks and discussions with people in different part of the stakeholders chain. So if any of you in the room is working in the private sector, in academia, in government, and have an interesting perspective, something they want to share with me, please do reach out. I'm willing to set up a meeting and learn from you guys. Okay, into the papers, and the reason I'm putting papers as a plural is that while I am talking about another paper that is specifically focused on Norway, I also want to mention another one that is very much the twin project of the one on Norway. This one is called From the Ground to the Stars, the Vertical Politics of the EU Drone Wall and Airspace Defense, which has been, with two colleagues, has been recently accepted for publication in the Journal of Common Market Studies, and very much connects to what Fiammetta was saying about this verticalization of defense and security. She was talking about it in the context of law, but we also examine that from a political perspective. And we look at the European Commission Defense Readiness Roadmap 2030. Particularly, my role within this paper was to look at the European Space Shield and what this European Space Shield means for European, defense and security. Now into the project that, or the paper that I'm gonna talk about for the next 6 minutes. This is very much focused on Norway and stemming from the research that we're doing as part of the MOD project that I mentioned before. Now, the research design is a qualitative case study of Norway as an emerging case study, where we try to focus on the interaction between geopolitical dynamics, governance frameworks, and sustainability agendas. We have analyzed a lot of sources. I've just put some in parentheses. And the idea is also to compare not only the sources, but what Norway is doing across different multilateral and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And then the question that we try to answer briefly is Norway managing to punch above its weight, which is something that has been informing Norwegian foreign policy for many, many years. And we identified two mechanisms that Norway is using actively to exercise agency in space politics. The first one is an active posture at different levels. The first level is at the national one, and here is the proposed legislation for the renovation of the Norwegian Space Act, which I'm sure other panelists that have a low background probably know more about than I do, but we can maybe discuss this later on. So there is this national interest and this movement of like trying to come up with legislation that can meet the technical challenges that Fiammetta was also talking about. And then there is a European level of engagement, which I've tried to capture here in a picture. This is from last November when the European Space Agency and the Norwegian Space Agency signed an agreement for exploring potentially the possibility of establishing a NASA research center here in Tromsø. And then you have the international level, which obviously this is from May 2025. It's the signing of Norway into the Artemis Accords. I think as of now we are counting 61 countries with Oman, who just joined, I think, last week. Obviously, this is a US-led initiative, which is leaving out both China and Russia, and that tells you about how Norway is positioning in the international arena. But also another initiative which I figure I could mention is the Space for Ocean, which was also signed last year in June in Nice, and yet is another perspective because this was initiated by CNES, which I'm not sure what the name is in English, but it's within the framework of the United Nations, and the United Nations Outer Space, what is it called? UNOSA is part of the alliance. Then the second mechanism is what I call a doubling down on critical infrastructure. Obviously, Globus in Vardø is a good example of that. Globus is run by the Norwegian Intelligence Service and has been the target of a lot of, let's say, attention from the Russian side because of what the function of the radar is and what the function of the radar is not. There is let's say, an understanding that it functions as somewhat the highs and hears of NATO up in the Arctic, and it's obviously of strategic importance to Norway to be able to do that within the context of NATO. And then you have the recent announcement again of submarine sea cables with the Arctic Way cable system that is meant to be running by 2028 and connecting Jan Mayen, Bodø, and Svalbard, and replacing the old Svalbard submarine cables. And then possibly the one that is getting most in the headlines in the newspaper, the Andoya spaceport, which is obviously very important not only for Norwegian but for European space security going forward. And then Svalbsat, which we can talk about more later if anyone wants, but it's obviously of strategic importance because it's the largest downlink infrastructure capability. And it's based in close to Longyearbyen, so with running discussions about Svalbard and, yes, 2 minutes, yes, and what could happen to Svalbard in the context of, the discussions about Greenland, etc. This is also something we can talk about later. But as in good academic settings, I'm not going to finish with solution, I'm going to finish with challenges and some preliminary points for further discussion that I hope we can expand on. The first one is the Arctic Space Nexus. Both the Arctic and space are becoming increasingly hot domains, as we have heard from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the investment in this nexus creates a possibility where operations in one domain might result in de-escalation in the other and vice versa. Then a second point is the problem related to critical infrastructure and the increasing use of hybrid warfare from adversaries, read Russia, and what legal and normative regime can be set up to counter that. Then a third point of reflection, which again we can expand on later in the panel, is the question of the readjustment of Norwegian foreign and security policies when you have a US which has demonstrated to be, let's say, unreliable, let's say, a course of European rearmament as well as increased Nordic cooperation. And then I need to run because I have 20 seconds. The fragility of legal and normative frameworks, which is very obvious, again, just looking at international events in the past year, I would say, or in 2025. And then the latest one, which I really wanted to finish on, is that we are, including myself, spending a good deal of time looking more at security and defense issues, and other issues are getting deprioritized. And this is something that we should, this trade-off is something that we should try to talk more about. And also within academia, following up on the discussion that I guess everyone was at before, where the professor, I can't remember the name, the professor that is based in the US was also pointing this out. We see that in the way the funding has been attributed as well. There is a push for short-term, policy-oriented research project on defense readiness, preparedness, etc. That comes at a cost, and the cost is the other projects that are not getting funding. So we should think about the consequences of that in the medium and long term. That was it. I'll finish on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giacomo, for a very stimulating presentation. I think it's going to be a good follow-up on some questions with regards. Stage. That's not work. It's working. Giacomo, I trust that you're there and you hear us. I don't see you, but I mean Leonardo. So now we have a good amount of time for questions. So I want to open the floor immediately. I have some questions on my own, and I'll ask them respective to the three presenters. But first, yes. Oh, you need the same microphone.
Hello, my name is Bo Andersen. I'm the previous Director General of the Norwegian Space Agency, and also previous chair of KSAT in building up Svalsat. I want to make a couple of comments and a few questions. One comment is the first talk we had from Professor. There you should just remove Arctic, because everything you said there is applicable to a ground station anywhere in the world. And because what you say, the ground stations are ruled by the national law. And that is a fundamental issue. Like the ground station, the only ground station that has additional issues is the Svalsat station, because that has to adhere to the Spitsbergen Treaty, so it cannot be used for offensive military use. Otherwise, all ground stations around the world are ruled by national law in these countries. So your arguments are correct in the sense of looking at all the different international laws that do not act together, but that does not specifically apply to the Arctic. It applies to everywhere in that sense. But one problem which you did not bring up, any of you, is the issue that launching things into space is governed by national laws everywhere. So for example, as long as you fill up the space, and it's agreed by national law, for example, with Starlink and Elon Musk with 10,000s of satellites after a time, will fill up space, and that is only governed by US national law. And that is a fundamental thing, is because the different EU wants to do the same, China wants to do the same. So that, I think, is a real big problem in space with the non-integration of the different laws. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I agree with you. The basis is national, so I know that space ground-based are national, and then also then in Svalbard there is a different case because Svalbard as the treaty. Yes, what I was saying is that we have different level of legislation, different legal regimes. So we have national, but we have also European level sometimes and international level. But also in international level, we have several regimes that are closed. So we have law of the sea, we have cooperation among states that is based on treaty, and we have also space law, the international space law, that is not so sophisticated. I agree with you, but we have something. So I agree with you, and I agree with you also in the fact that there is a gap. There is a gap between national, international, and international regime. And this gap is a gap, a lacuna that cannot filled by regime interaction, that cannot be filled by interpretation of treaty or national legislation. So one option is try to have a treaty, try to have more cooperation. But I don't think that today is the time of a new treaty or cooperation. So we have to work with what we have. And that's why I decided to base my presentation on this fragmentation by omission and take by function principle that can be applied to the activity, to space activities. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, just two thoughts that came to my mind in relation to your comments. The first one is about Svalbard and Svalsat. It's interesting, when we were talking as part of the project with some friends at KSAT, we were trying to figure out what was the legal constraints on the use of data. And one of those is that you're not supposed to use data for military purposes, only for civilian ones. But that also means that some of the data that you could potentially use, you cannot access, because otherwise you would be in violation of the space of the Svalbard Treaty. So there is a huge potential there for data that could be. So the point I'm trying to make is that with AI and AI processing machines, etc., we have a problem. The problem we have is that we have more data than we can process, basically. But those data could be potentially relevant. So the Svalbard Treaty is playing out in particular ways. And then the second point about what you said about Starlink and the occupying the orbits, etc. This is obviously a big issue, and it talks to the very long problem of having state depending on private actors. It is an issue, and it is an issue that we have been seeing playing out already in recent conflicts. And this has been on the headlines when there was the war, in some context in the war in Ukraine, where Elon Musk said he would allow access to Starlink data, and then at some point he said, "No, I won't. If you do this and if you do that." So this is something that is present already. Besides all discussions about will Europe be able to place its own satellites in space, which, by the way, we are lagging ages behind. At least in comparison to Starlink, but it is already an issue of deep political interest.
More questions? Okay, then I'll ask while you consider a question on my own. It's really for all three. Unless, Leonardo, do you want to add something on this first? Maybe not. So my question is really about, so taking point of departure on your presentation, but the question of dual use and the question that comes with it, which is the problem of securitization. so that everything is kind of securitized these days because of the geopolitical context, the tensions that arise, and that puts pressure, and I'm a law sea lawyer, so puts pressure on the regime of marine scientific research. Any activity can really be considered to kind of cross the threshold from science to, let's say, security-related activities. And so this poses like a broad problem, not only of regulatory consistency or functional fragmentation, but it kind of goes to the broader question of how to integrate the need for, and we heard in the big picture session, the cry for not making science the victim of this problematic, which is fundamental for the management of the key problem in the Arctic in particular, which is climate change, for the long haul. And so how to manage this tension without, so one thing is the regulation of dual use as such, and I very much liked your problematization of the binary civil military. It's a lot more complicated, but the other is how to frame this in a governance architecture that is reflected in a lot of processes, from the UNOSA process of the regulation, the future regulation of space activities, and on the basis of the framework that exists, to the question of accessing the orbital domain, which is already overcrowded, and it's understood in adversarial terms. You mentioned how the Artemis Accord framework is explicitly excluding key actors. So this is all kind of, from my point of view, raises really big issue of how to really promote narratives that are inclusive rather than exclusive, recognizing the problematics that are always present, in terms of security, but without making them the overwhelming focus of even innocent interpretation of legal acts. So I wanted to have your views on this.
It's a very big question, thank you. So when I started to study this topic, what I imagined to find was overlapping regulations. So I was sure that there was something in international space law, something in national law, something, and I was also sure in my mind that there were norms that interact or norms that were overlapping. And then when I started dual use infrastructure, I found that there were not overlapping. It was like regime was subsequent, or they don't touch each other. That was very strange to me, and so what I started to think was, okay, so probably this infrastructure, this dual-use infrastructure, can be the topic to study. So the object of the study, so the object of regulation. And then also, I was confused because the object of regulation, which kind of regulation? International law, national law, European law of the sea, what? So what I found at the end, in my mind, but I don't know, it's just a way, a perspective, and we can discuss it together, is that it's like infrastructure, this dual-use infrastructure for space activities appear like light switch. So like they switch light, so they switch legal regime, different legal regime, like a trigger, but then it's not so easy to find the regime that is relevant. And in all this situation, it's clear that defense is so important today. So it's once again, not the object, but probably the objective, no? It's not the object of study, but we know that data surveillance for climate change is also relevant for defense, for states, for sovereignty. So what I think is these dual-use technologies are like switch light. So all the regime are involved in this area, and we have to find some principle, some legal categories that can help us to find a framework, a strong framework that probably is not present today, but we have to build together, not as a politician, but as a lawyer and interpreter. I don't know.
Yeah, I can try to elaborate some thoughts on the securitization of the Arctic. Obviously, I don't have a precise answer. I'm just going to say my internal different contrasting narratives that even myself, I find myself grappling with as a researcher, because on the one side, I very much agree with what you're saying. I think climate change should be the priority. I think inclusiveness should be something under discussion, and I think we are moving away from that. At the same time, when I look at what is the reason we're moving away from it, it's difficult not to say that the main reason we're moving away from this is because we are nearly 4 years from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has had the obvious implication on European security. When we look at the history of what has been militarizing the Arctic, the answer is the same as to the point before, and that is Russia. I was this morning at a panel on the implications of the war in Ukraine on the Arctic, and all the panelists were agreeing on this very point, on the fact that before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was NATO countries that were trying to de-escalate the militarization of the Arctic, and then on the other side, Russia always doing provoking actions and threats such as flying towards globus up until they're close enough and then turning around, or having their submarines appearing in Norwegian economic zone or Norwegian waters. So I'm myself confronted with an idealistic side and a defense reality, which is that unfortunately Norway and Europe shares border with Russia, and Russia has proven several times to be a threat to our security. So it's difficult really to think about ways to move this forward. I'll close it here. I can elaborate more, but please, anyone.
Thank you. Leonardo, did you want to add your views?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes?
Thank you. Just a small point on the environmental concerns that you mentioned and the other speakers mentioned. Drawing on the points raised during my presentation, I think that it is fundamental to treat space operations and space environment and also the Arctic environment as global commons, as common goods. And I think that this is the only way to manage such complex problems like environmental protection of outer space and also the defense issues. So I think that this is the point, to treat these goods like common goods. And that's my point on this.
Okay, thank you. Question from...
Johannes Schmid-Virén from Heinrich Center for Business and Governance. I have a question concerning to what you explained and treaties, long-term perspectives. What are the time frames within your fields that you're usually talking about, and what are the the challenges with these timeframes. I'm asking because you mentioned 4 years war in Ukraine. Crimea was earlier. Treaties from the 50s that we heard about, Greenland. So just to get a dimension, earlier days I was in forestry, and there we have the long time frames, and short time frames can interrupt that. So just could you make some reflections in your fields? What are showstoppers because of time frames? Where do you see you can act because of understanding those time frames?
Thank you.
I can give it a try. So time frames. So the first thing I was thinking about when you were talking about time frames is something I mentioned during my presentation at the very end, which is that we are now asked to think much shorter terms than before. Because of where the funding is going in academic research, we're not asked anymore, or we are asked that as well, but a lot of funding is going towards policy-oriented research, which means you get funding for 1 year, you do research, write a report, talk to the ministries, do policy recommendations, which is something very different from the nature of academic research. That in and of itself changes the way you're thinking in terms of timeframes. So the point you made, for example, about Russia and the invasion of Crimea, etc., that is a very important point, and it's also a reminder that even when you look at the longer trends with respect to Russia, then the picture becomes even clearer, I would say. Another interesting reflection on timeframes is the whole issue of European rearmament. It seems like it's something that it's coming up as a priority now, but if you look at US interaction with European leaders, they've been asking European leaders to raise the percentage of the GDP on defense for 20 plus years. Trump 1 was very clear about this before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in the full invasion in 2022. He said this, Russia is a threat to Europe, you should increase your budgets. So the truth, the impression I'm left with is that, we knew this could happen. The point where, European states need to stand up and might need to stand up on their own was there. So maybe to your point of time frames, it could be useful sometimes to try to think about the longer trends. What we have been seeing now, for example, with the disruption of the international order and all these very nice speeches by Mark Kearney and others. These are pointing at very, very important issues, but it's not something that materialized in 2 days, This friction and this fraction of the order that it talks about is something that has been there for arguably since 9/11 at least, So maybe it could be useful to think a bit longer term.
I will talk about time, law, and Arctic. I will try. So about law, we usually say that ex facto oritur ius. So by the fact, by the circumstances, arise law. So this is one step. Then in international law, we usually say that international law is aspirational. So it's something that you would like to be. So that's why for international law, it's a disaster that there is a violation of erga omnes obligation. That is, for civil law, criminal law is very usual to have a violation. For us, to have a violation is a nightmare. And so I will jump to Arctic. In the Arctic, I think that changes are very fast. So I start to study Arctic governance in 2008. And in Italy, I was probably the only one international law scholar studying Arctic cooperation. Today, there is a huge debate about Arctic, about climate change, about security issues, about cooperation inside Arctic and outside the Arctic. So I often hear to speak about global Arctic in Italy. So, the time has changed. How fast? I don't know. Maybe today, because X factor, or it use, because international law is not so aspirational anymore, and because of condition of Arctic, maybe the time to create cooperation or to create framework is very short. But also, in international law, it's very difficult to create legislation, some binding rules in a very short term. So it will be a huge challenge for international law. We will see. We will see.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The temporalities, it's crucial. And if I may just take my privilege as a chair to add the point that international law is not like architecturally not structured to address short-term issues unless there is already a framework, because the mechanics of its development are complex. And usually when there's treaty developments or negotiations, you will have yearly meetings, which stretches over a long time, preceded by informal negotiations and followed by, if and when a treaty is adopted, by a long implementation process. So we're talking decades. So it's not really apt as a mechanism to address present circumstances that erupt suddenly, unless you have already a framework. And even when you have a framework, it's difficult if the political intensity of the question is too high. But before the next question, Leonardo, did you want to add also something on this?
I don't have any hats on this. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, we have a good time for more questions, so I invite you to raise your hand, and if not, I will look at my notes. One question that I wanted to ask, in particular to Giacomo, but also, again, open for all other panelists, it's really about the spillover. So we're talking about these interactions of the space domain, activities that take place in space that are crucial for the environmental and security management of the Arctic. So there's clearly interactions there and cross-domain coordination needs, but there's also a problem of spillover in terms of strategic competition that moves kind of seamlessly in a way, or there's a risk that this kind of spills over from one domain to another with all the connections. You mentioned some in terms of utilization, private constellation networks for military purposes. So I just want you to elaborate a little bit in this spillover problem.
Okay, the spillover problem. Okay, the starting point of the spillover is, as I said before, that I think both the Arctic and space, in their own separate ways, are becoming very much the center of geopolitical competition between so-called great powers. For different reasons, some of which are interconnected. So, for example, if you look at the issue of Greenland, Greenland is also relevant for space reasons, and I'll try to elaborate on this. So the Trump administration announced the so-called Golden Dome, which is a $1 trillion investment missile defense system. If for that to function properly, you would need to have control over Greenland, according to Trump himself. So you see how space has a spillover on the Arctic, and the other way around. Because, for example, when you look at the issue of Svalbard, again because of the presence of Svalsat, what was already a geopolitical tension over the sovereignty of Svalbard, at least in Russians' military and political thinking, becomes extremely relevant as well for the issue, for space-related issues. Now, for a country like Norway, who's been investing a lot on critical infrastructure in space, there is a balancing act that Norway needs to deal with when investing in space critical infrastructure, while making sure that that doesn't come across as an escalation to adversaries, while making sure that you are cooperating with your NATO allies, and obviously again, European countries, including Norway, are in a context where the biggest of ally in military terms is the US, where the president is Trump. That in and of itself is a very uncertain person to deal with, which has a lot of consequences for how you deal with it. And then you have, again, the issue of European rearmament, which is being instrumentalized by Russia and others. And that in and of itself is also an issue, because even within the European Union, you have very different threat perceptions. So what the Arctic, for example, and my panelists might disagree, but I don't think it's a political priority in Italy at all. It has become maybe recently because of Greenland, but the threat perception of Italian policymakers, Spanish policymakers, Portuguese policymakers, the list goes on, is very different, and such difference is also on how much you will be able to protect the infrastructures there. So it's a very complicated issue. What I'm trying to get at is that both domains are deeply interconnected, and there is a risk of one influencing the other and potentially leading to an escalation, which is obviously nothing that any of us want.
I will add just another perspective. So I will compare law of the sea and space law. So two domains. No? Sea and space are interconnected, not just because we have infrastructure that are relevant for both domains, but also because the legal framework is quite similar. So international space law has arisen by the law of the sea, so the idea of the IC, the idea of seabed, no? And we know that the legal framework is different, but also today the interest in IC and seabed is for resources, and the interest in space is for resources, and maybe also the interest in Arctic is for energy resources once again. So there is this interconnection that is a connection of circumstances, political, strategical, but also the legal regime are quite similar, let's say. So this is interesting. Also, if international space law is not so sophisticated as law of the sea. No?
Leonardo, did you want to come in with additional views?
Thank you. I strongly agree with Professor Borgia's view. And I think that this is the main reason why we need an hybrid governance for this kind of goods, for the sea, for Arctic, for space. So this is the reason why we should advocate for a hybrid governance of these shared domains. That's my point. my brief points.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? No, I have another question myself. Again, for all three, really, it's just a broad question that brings some of these points we raised today, again, in the broader context of what is politically possible. And Leonardo, you were referring to the preamble of BBNJ agreement, and in particular to the need to establish or the wish to promote the establishment of an equitable international economic order, which resonates obviously with the political context within which the Outer Space Treaty and the Law of the Sea Convention were negotiated during the emergence of the newly developed formed state after the colonization, the new international economic order movement. And today we have seen that one of the key political novelties is this emergence of a parallel framework supported by the BRICS, China. So there is this large space that's been developed to articulate a novel architecture, which is a bit in competition with the, let's say, Western-led economic order. And within this context, how can we imagine then that this political realignments may have an impact on the development of the rules and principles that govern the law and outer space domains, but also the discourses on security with these parallel security arrangements? It's another big question, but I thought it was interesting to kind of explore how this plays out with the view of imagining good environmental stewardship that cuts across both the outer space and the marine domain.
So it's a very big question. So how this will impact on the law, on the international legal framework? I think that international space law is designed, is drawn by states, for states, but today in the space we have more private company that the states, and it's true that the responsibility is the responsibility of national states in which the infrastructure is registered. But it's also true that the amount of private company that we have in space, I think that will be another challenge for international space law. So China, it's true that we have another framework, another political framework, but in this framework we have also the rising of big company in domain that traditionally were dominated by states. So this will be another issue for the legal framework and for international space law.
Yeah, I'll come at this, obviously not with a law perspective, but on this idea of the emergence of competing legal frameworks and political alliances, etc. This is an issue that I guess we could agree it's not only related to the Arctic and space, it's a growing trend. China particularly has been very active in trying to create alternative institutions to the one of the so-called Western international liberal order, or call it as you want. When it comes to space, it's interesting. You mentioned BRICS, but BRICS is BRICS really the platform where space things will happen? I'm not that sure because, for example, yes, China and Russia are out of the Artemis Accords, but India is not. And Brazil is not. Both countries are part of the Artemis Accords, so that that signals that there is. We are at a point where yes, there is a fracture in what we have called the international liberal order, but I'm not entirely sure what will emerge from it. So in a way, what I'm thinking is it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think if I'm being realistic, I struggle to see ways for major powers to come to an agreement and potentially develop new legislation on this matter, precisely because they are at the center of the geopolitical competition, for as unfortunate as it is. And I think the states that will need to try to be as proactive as possible are small and medium states, because those are the ones who are caught in between the big powers, you know. And for a state like Norway, I think it would be interesting to explore other partnerships, you know, behind the traditional alliances Norway has been having. So China, India are two obvious candidates in the list. Unfortunately, I think the paradigm that has informed Norwegian foreign policy for decades is shifting, and so should the political actions, I think.
Yeah, so when you were talking, it made me think of Mr. Carney's mention of if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But also of how all these transformations require pragmatic approaches. Leonardo, before moving on to the next question, did you want to add something, since I called you directly into question with regards to the reference to the preamble of the BBNG agreement and your presentation?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think that it is fundamental to have in the corpus of international law such a provision like the BBNG agreement preamble. Like the BBNG agreement preamble, and it will be fundamental to take into consideration the interests and needs of humankind as a whole in the new regulation of outer space, both hard and soft law. It will be fundamental to implement this, or we will see the death, will be dramatic, of international space law and international space regulation. So in my opinion, this is a non-negotiable principle for the future of international space law and space regulation.
All right, thank you. So there was a question up, or a hand up for a question. Yes, this is, I think, the very last before we need to.
Thank you for giving me this chance to ask a question. Just now, I heard some of the experts talking about the rule-based world order. So I just wonder, how do you see the change of today's situation that the country, America, who create this rule-based international order, and now we all know that just a few days ago, President Trump said that the U.S. will withdraw from the 66th International Organization. And related to our today's topic, the space governance, I think the commercial development, just like the Elon Musk, who said he will eject a large dose of the satellites into the space. So, but nowadays we are still lack of the comprehend the regulation of the space. So how do you see this? If the United States, and also the very large company like the Elon Musk, SpaceX, move this trend like they do what they want, how can we governance the space, just as the topic said, in a sustainable way, or to make it the sustainable development of this outer space? Thank you.
I can say just a few words. On the US and the effects of the Trump administration on the international order, I think it's an accelerator. I think the crisis of the international order have been there for many years. The fractures have been there for some years, and Mr. Trump is just accelerating those. But I also wouldn't attribute all of the problems with the international order and the situation we see now to the US alone. I think other countries have been committing several violations of international law. And then on the other one, on how to regulate the private sector, next panel. Yeah, it's a very broad question. So I'm looking at the time, and I think we are over time already. I really don't have an answer to this. What is very obvious is that there is an emerging dependency on these private sector actors, and that is a political problem that we need to deal with, because these companies do not respond to democratic ruling. They respond to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, or you name it. And that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. But I leave that to the lawyers.
It's true that private company nowadays are creating programs in space, but before the space, they are creating programs, also legal programs and environmental programs, human rights programs among states, jumping from a country to another country. So I think the problem is the same. My first book was about corporate social responsibility. So it was about multinational corporation and violation of human rights in the world. So I think the framework, the legal framework is similar. So before these companies, they created programs in national legal order, in small national legal order, or just doing forum shopping. So by choosing the national legal order that was the best for their affairs. So using the regulatory framework, the national legal order that was cheapest for their activities. So I think the problem is quite the same. Now they are ready to probably to jump in space, so they are ready because with the satellites they already do that. And regulation. It was difficult to make a framework for the regulation of these companies at the international level before. Why? Because each company is subject to national regulation. So that's why it's very difficult for international law regulating and avoiding some violation of human rights or environmental environmental programs. So I think it's also more difficult today making a regulation for this company, because also in this case the regulation should be national. So before national and then probably international, it will be very difficult to regulate this kind of activities at international level without a framework, without an international framework. And in this case, I think the only option is a negotiation. I usually prefer to use what we have, but in this situation we don't have so much, so we need a regulation.
Thank you. I think we can then close the session here. So let's join me in giving a big hand to the presenters. And then I'll remind you that after the break, there is a second session of our science session on the governance and policy of space activities. So I hope to see you there, and thank you again to everybody, and have a good day.